This is a story about a porcupine and a rabbit. I always do like to tell stories about animals who get to know each other in circumstances that they probably wouldn't normally encounter, and just to tell the story of how well they did together. In only a few weeks, spring will be tinting the treetops green, and the wildflowers once more will cover the Texas landscape. Already the sparrows are flitting about, gathering bits of dried grass and discarded feathers to construct their nest for this year's soon-to-be-laid eggs. Baby possums have bravely ventured out of their mother's pouches and are clinging tenaciously to their backs. All of these harbingers of spring do not quite seem so real when you look at the calendar hanging on the wall. This day is warm and sunny, and if we are hit with an end of the winter blizzard, as we were over 25 years ago, we might be surprised with late winter, early spring babies. It was February of 1980. All of central Texas was enjoying spring-like weather. The days were sunny and breezy, the nights cool and calm. The weather forecasters were confident that the Arctic front that had slammed into the Midwest would have little effect on our part of the world. Not surprisingly, they were mistaken. Early one morning, just before daybreak, the winds shifted, and when they did, there were no more cool breezes. Now in their place were ice-chilled gusts of no less than 30 miles per hour. The severely cold wind would have been enough to convince us that winter was still present, but Mother Nature decided to send us a generous dose of moisture as well. By mid-morning, the trees at the sanctuary were covered in shimmering sheets of ice. San Antonio was not to escape the winter blast either. Tree limbs came crashing to the ground, electric wires were sagging under the weight of ice, and most major highways were shut. We knew what this meant to native wildlife. Any babies who were in their nests were threatened, especially if their mothers or fathers had met disaster in the storm. We waited for the phones to ring. The first orphan of this storm was a small but fully furred squirrel. Her nest had fallen to the ground. Her mother had retrieved all the siblings, but she did not come back for this baby. She was fat and healthy, so we knew that this little one would be fine, and in only a few weeks, she could once again go free. 5 more baby squirrels came in that same day, so at least now we had a complete family who could grow up as siblings. The most unusual baby in need of rescue was yet to come. In late February, even in very cold winters, we were accustomed to rescuing baby squirrels and baby possums. Raccoons, skunks, bobcats, and foxes rarely gave birth in the winter, but this new baby was a member of a species we had only rescued once before, and that was in the middle of summer. There was no way of knowing exactly what had happened to Mom, but when this tiny baby was found wandering in the backyard in far northwest San Antonio, it was clear that she was very cold and very hungry. The young man who brought the helpless infant porcupine to us was not certain whom he'd rescued. He first thought this was someone's so-called pet hedgehog. The little baby's paws were frozen solid. Her quills were coated in ice, and her soft, dark eyelashes closed tightly over her small, round eyes. Her breath was shallow and barely noticeable. We had little hope for her survival, but she was young, and if she'd not been away from her mother too long, she might just have a chance. After 3 long hours spent sleeping on a heating pad, the baby porcupine was showing signs of recovery. We had warm fluids to help her, and within 2 more hours, the frozen baby was up and waddling about. Now she was able to burrow softly in the bed of alfalfa that we had prepared for her in her small area. Her high-pitched, barely audible, pitiful-sounding cries were her only form of protest. This baby was weak and she was frightened. By late that evening, the porcupine was reasonably stable, but she needed to be bottle-fed. She was still nursing when her mother had disappeared, and now we had to continue that process. The only problem was that the baby knew full well we were not her mother. Trying to bottle feed a baby porcupine, quills and all, who does not want to be fed, is a challenge. Little by little, she learned to tolerate us. Porcupines are docile animals, but like all wild animals, they would prefer not to be bothered by humans. The most important issue for this little female was to help her reach a stage where she could feed herself. This way, she would not be stressed by our presence, and she would not become dangerously dependent on our help. By mid-March, the female porcupine was able to lap formula from a shallow bowl, and she was slowly beginning to chew on plants and vegetables provided for her. In the wild, porcupines develop very rapidly, but this baby had a slow and dangerous beginning. In addition, she had to deal with the fact that she was the only one of her kind in our care. It was not likely that we would be rescuing any more porcupines. We simply didn't see that many. So we decided to find someone who could serve as a suitable companion for her. Living at Wildlife Rescue that same winter was a rather old, large, brown domesticated rabbit. He was the only domesticated rabbit at the sanctuary at the time, and he too had no companions. The day we introduced the dissimilar two, we were not exactly optimistic that they would get along. The big rabbit was released into the porcupine's small indoor enclosure. He immediately hopped over to investigate this strange quilled resident. The rabbit sniffed and quickly jumped back. The porcupine called out in her plaintive tone. The old brown rabbit stopped, and his ears leaned forward. The porcupine's cry is not unlike the cry of a little rabbit in distress. Now the rabbit seemed less threatened by the quilled youngster. It was clear that the young porcupine wanted the rabbit's attention. The rabbit simply had to relax and let the porcupine do the rest. The old rabbit lay down on his side, his ears back, relaxing. He was now more curious than he was afraid. The young porcupine waddled over and began nudging into the rabbit's soft, warm fur. The rabbit's long whiskers twitched, his nose wiggled. He had changed his mind about his new companion. By nightfall, the two were comfortable in each other's company. By the end of the week, they were inseparable. Thanks to the companionship and care from this elderly rabbit, the young porcupine learned to care for herself. She was grasping chunks of fresh carrot and apple in her once frozen paws, and she was agilely browsing through piles of tender green foliage. She climbed to the top of a sturdy oak branches in the enclosure as the brown rabbit remained content on the ground, feeding on fresh green alfalfa. The docile porcupine, who had once teetered on the edge of death, was now strong, fat, and full of life. It was time for her to return to her world. The spring weather had settled in. The trees were vibrant green, and every inch of earth was covered once again with bright flowers of soft grass. The ice of previous month had melted, and the sun was warming every new day. An early morning in mid-April was chosen as the day to set the porcupine free. As we approached the enclosure, we could hear her distinct, distressing cries. In only minutes, we would learn why she was so upset. Sometime during the night, the old brown rabbit had died. The porcupine was nudging at his fur and getting no response. These two very different animals had grown to care for one another, had spent months in each other's company, and now the younger of the two was to go free. The elder had reached ultimate freedom. We left the two together for a time, but decided it was best to go ahead with our plans. As we arrived at the release site, the porcupine was sitting quietly in her carrier. There were tall trees and dense underbrush. There was a nearby river and 3 quiet ponds. Other porcupines had often been seen here, and we knew this would be a good world for her as well. The door to her carrier was opened, and with that familiar waddle, she made her way out of the carrier, across a narrow pasture and into the densely wooded acreage. She did not look back. She did not utter a cry. She simply returned to her world. I do not doubt that forever in her memory will remain the gentle companionship of one elderly brown rabbit who shared her life for a brief and very important time, and who made her days as a captive a little bit easier to bear. So I always say that I only tell happy stories, or stories with happy endings. I admit I try to do that, but I don't think that we can feel that an elderly animal dying in the company of a friend is really a sad ending, even though, of course, it is a sad ending, I think, from a human perspective. I think all of us would like nothing but happiness for the animals we care about and the animals we want to protect. But we know that's not always possible. This story is important to me because, as I said earlier, it's just wonderful. It's not surprising because I've seen enough of animal behavior to know how wonderful they are, just innately wonderful they are. So it isn't surprising to me, but I feel that it is wonderful and important that people understand that non-human animals, their emotional life and their societal life and their souls and their hearts are so rich and deep and complex and diverse. And yet our species just doesn't give them credit for any of that, for having any of those attributes. I read so many stories people send me because I say, oh, isn't this just amazing what this animal did? And I think, no, but it isn't amazing. It's just who they are. And yes, they are wonderful in everything they do and how they are, but it isn't surprising. It's just that we don't ever attribute these wonderful aspects and ways of behavior to them. So at Wildlife Rescue, we do our best to do that. And in these stories, I try to do that as well. Does anybody have any questions or comments for me this evening? No, porcupine babies, their quills aren't really all that hard as of yet. And plus, interesting thing about porcupines, their quills will kind of lay down flat. Because if you ever look at a porcupine, there's fur. There's not just quills, there's fur. And so the fur and the quills are intermingled. And the quills, like, they just kind of go flat the way the fur does. So there was never any problem with that. We have, speaking of porcupines, we have a small family of African crested porcupines who live with a small troop of monkeys. And they have about an acre of land, and it's very dense trees and all, and they live together. And the first encounter that the monkeys had with the porcupines and the African crested porcupines, if y'all don't know how big an animal they are, really big animals, and their quills are really big, really big. You might want to look them up. And their quills do come up, and they will, they'll slap their tails as a warning. And so their quills were up, and the monkeys are kind of thinking, wait a minute, what's going on here? Because their food was in the middle of everybody, and they all wanted the same food, good fresh fruits and vegetables. And the porcupines did tell the monkeys, because the monkeys are behind them trying to see what's going on. And the porcupines are giving a warning. So in that case, the quills definitely could have been a threat, but monkeys aren't stupid. Monkeys are very brilliant. And so the monkeys just simply came around the front. So the porcupines could see them, and there was no more threat. So the porcupine's quills went down, and everybody ate together. So it's not like a brush. Porcupines aren't like a brush where the bristles are always up. So the rabbit was fine with the porcupine quills. We're getting more calls on porcupines. That's a good point. And we are. And sad thing. We have gotten calls on porcupines who have just eaten up with mange. Mm-hmm. And it's just been gut-wrenching because poor babies. I mean, some of them are just every pore is just eaten up with mange. I don't know why they've been so vulnerable to it, but they have been. And I also don't know why, because we've never seen this. It's very difficult to cure them of it. They don't respond the way, say, coyotes do, or foxes, or dogs or cats with mange. So yes, porcupines seem to be extending their range. And in doing so, we're finding more who are in trouble. We're also finding citizens who don't understand that porcupines are harmless and very docile. And we also don't have motorists who are understanding that porcupines are slow when they're crossing the road at night. So yes, they are extending their range and they're getting into trouble, but we're just hoping there are more of them that are being able to be safe and love the new areas they're coming into. So we'll let y'all know if we start, maybe more stories on porcupines. Maybe we'll do some e-alerts about what's happening with porcupines in the area. They are a somewhat unusual animal for most of us. Most of us don't see them very regularly, but they, like all animals, are absolutely wonderful. That's a good point. I know. Well, that's always something too. And we're faced with this from time to time, that we have animals who can go free and animals who can't go free. And we do our best not to have those animals together. But there are also times when one animal will develop more rapidly than another. And obviously, we're not going to hold someone back to get, from getting back to their life in the wild because of another animal. Certainly not for a lengthy period of time. We might for a little while. But that has happened to us a number of times where somebody was able to go and somebody else simply wasn't. And it is absolutely heartbreaking. And, it's just, there's nothing to be done about it. And again, I have to say, I think that the way that we view those tragedies, if you want to call them that, which I don't think they are to the animals, I don't think they are, but the way that we view those incidents, those events, are not the way, I believe, are not the way they view them. Animals are so profoundly accepting of whatever life gives them. They're so profoundly grounded in the oneness that exists in all of nature, that instead of, oh, poor me, and this is terrible, and all of this, they just accept. They accept, and I fully believe they understand, and they adapt, and they move on. When you think of the number of animals we've gotten out of laboratories who have been through horrific situations, and roadside zoos, horrific situations, you or I, spending years in those horrible places, would come out of, we'd just be wrecked. We'd be emotionally wrecked. They aren't. They just hang in there and hold on and stick with what they know to be true. And that is that life is so much bigger than any one of us. And that if you trust in the oneness and somehow get through each day, then you'll somehow be okay. And I don't know that we have that same resilience or strength as a species that they certainly do.